I apologise if I yawn during this talk, by the way. I'm a little bit jet-lagged. I'll try to cover it up. I'd like you all to do something for me, if you would, please. I'd like you all to go offline. If you've got your laptops out, if you've got your phones out, I'd like you all to switch the Wi-Fi off. If you've got a data connection on your phone, you can switch that off. Maybe go into airplane mode. It's really easy. Don't be afraid. You know, we'll be all right. We'll get through this. On a Mac, you can switch your Wi-Fi off from up in the toolbar there. Can't see many people doing it. You all look a bit nervous. So for those of you who've just gone offline, welcome to ZEN mode. This is supposed to be an aeroplane that's got emoji arms, gone into ZEN mode. How are you feeling? Are you a bit nervous? Are you a bit uncomfortable? Going offline can make us feel really disconnected. A lot of us here, we all work in the web industry. We probably connect to the internet when we wake up in the morning. We probably keep connected all day until we're falling asleep in bed. So going offline can make us feel really disconnected, kind of like you may be feeling now. But what about going offline while we're working, right when we think we'll need that internet connection to do our job? Well, firstly, I find that sometimes I need to work while I'm offline. If I'm traveling, if I'm on a train with a poor internet connection, if I'm on an aeroplane with no internet connection, or even at a conference or in a coffee shop where the Wi-Fi isn't any good. And I still need to get stuff done. But you might choose to go offline too. I find going offline to be quite relaxing, and I can actually be quite efficient and productive when I'm offline. Those of you who work remotely, how often do you see somebody say something like this? I'm going offline for a while to concentrate. Well, why would they say that? Well, it turns out that working offline can be productive. It's often focused and free of distractions, and I actually find it quite calming. But I work in a remote team and I build websites for a living. How can I possibly get any work done when I'm not connected to the internet? Well, having the right tools and the right frame of mind can really help with this. It can make working offline a joy. It can make it productive. But the important thing is that you need to be prepared. If I asked you all to start building a website now, you might be a bit stuck. For those of you who did switch that Wi-Fi off. So there's 5 key points I've found to working productively offline. The first is preparation. Preparation is everything. Without it, you won't be able to get anything constructive done while you're offline. The right tools are vital to being able to actually get stuff done. The right mindset is vital to being productive. And these 3 tend to kind of blend into one sometimes. There are some considerations for when you reconnect after you've been offline for a while. And finally, if things go wrong, having a backup plan means that you can usually get something done if the worst comes to the worst. So let's take a look at these points one by one. Now, everything that you do while you're offline requires preparation. You have to have prepared beforehand. Preparation is everything. So the first step to working efficiently offline is to download the internet onto your laptop. If you've got enough disk space. Don't try this at the airport while you're tethered to your data connection. You're going to burn through your monthly allowance. For most people, this isn't practical. So what you really need to do is think about what you're going to do when you're offline and plan accordingly. For example, trying to build something that you haven't had any experience with building before might not be a good idea if you think you need to refer to online documentation or tutorials. But actually, it could be a challenge. You might find that you know more than you think you do without having to refer to online documentation. But either way, you need an environment to work in. Whether you use a local web server or a Vagrant machine, you'll need to ensure that it's set up prior to going offline. A well-built project, hopefully, will run version control. You'll be able to pull in your dependencies using dependency managers such as Node and Composer, and you can get it all started with one command. This is a well-built project. But when we consider going offline, we can actually take this a bit further to aid our offline development. If you use the GitHub wiki for your documentation, the wiki is actually a repo on its own. You can go to the sidebar in a GitHub wiki, and it's got a URL there to clone the repo. You can clone it onto your local machine before you go offline. It's just made up of markdown files. You can edit those files, you can create files, and you can commit them to the repo and work with them while you're offline. And then once you reconnect, you can push those back up to the repo. It means you don't have to use the online wiki editor on github.com in your browser. You can do it all while you're offline. Prior to going offline, it's a really good idea to try and identify any assets that live on external hosts or CDNs, particularly fonts. A lot of modern websites use font libraries and things like that. You can actually install fonts locally. For example, if you use Google Fonts, you can go onto the Google Fonts website and you can download your entire font library for that project. You can install those fonts on your local machine. And that means when you go offline, your computer doesn't try to connect to fonts.google.com to load those fonts if it sees them on your local machine. It allows you to carry on working with the correct fonts. You may have a project that has dependencies on many third-party JavaScript libraries. I found it's a good time before you go offline to determine which dependencies you've got on your site which cause the site to completely break when they're not available. If you've got some external JavaScript and it's on some third-party host, if it doesn't load and that causes your website to break, this is actually a really good opportunity for you to consider how you can harden your website, how you can make it function if those third-party scripts aren't available for whatever reason. And I call this network resilience. We're still in the preparation phase, and in fact, we can already identify some end-user advantages to considering working offline. If we can consider the fact that these third-party assets on our site aren't always available due to connection problems with our users, we can work to improve that, make our site more resilient when third-party scripts aren't available, and therefore we end up having a better user experience for the end user if they have network problems or indeed no internet at all. Pretty neat. So connecting to the internet before you disconnect obviously is fairly important, but one thing you may not think about is some apps which perform a license check when you start them up. This is Pour. This is a really good HTTP client for Macs. But it performs a license check when you start it up, and if it can't connect to the internet, it won't let you use the app. And I've been caught out with this before. I'm sitting somewhere without an internet connection, I open up Pour, I can't use it because it can't connect to the internet to check my license. So a good idea is to open up all the apps that you think you might use before you go offline, just in case you get caught out with an online license check like this. You should also, of course, check to make sure that all of the online file services that you use have recently synced, things like Dropbox, Google Drive. The idea here is to try and make sure that when you do go offline, you aren't caught out without access to files and resources and things that you'll need to get your job done. Email clients, well, usually these sync themselves all the time, but just be aware of it. You might need to do a pull just before you go offline. And with Git, this is a really handy command, git fetch --all. What this does is this fetches all of the branches that are on your remote, and it makes them available locally. So if you want to check out pull requests or switch between branches when you're working locally, this command will fetch all of the branches from the remote and make them available locally for when you start working offline. So regardless of what you work on when you're offline, you may have clients or colleagues who might expect you to be online. So communicating with them to tell them that you're going to be offline is really important. Don't underestimate how important it is to communicate to your clients and your colleagues, to set expectations if you're going to be offline. Even if you're only going to be offline for 2 hours, that might be the point where your colleague or your client expects you to be online to answer questions. So that's typically the kind of preparation that you'll need to go offline, especially if you don't do it very frequently. But there are some tools that you can use which make working offline easier every time you go offline. One of the most important tools for me is offline documentation. There's a really annoying feature in the Mac OS. All of the built-in help docs for the built-in apps are actually online. So this is the help docs for Keynote when you're offline. It's not very useful. Luckily, though, as developers, you don't need to rely on online documentation for your developer references. On Mac, there's an app called Dash, and on Windows and Linux, it's called ZEN. And these apps provide offline documentation for over 200 scripting languages, programming languages, frameworks, applications, configuration files, references, and more. All of the documentation comes from the official resources. For example, for WordPress, it comes from a mixture of the codex and the developer.wordpress.org site. The documentation auto updates, it's searchable, and most importantly for me is it integrates directly into many developer apps. So this is my code editor. I've got my cursor here on a function name. And when I press the hotkey, it pops up with the modal window with Dash in it, right on the function name that I had my cursor in. I don't need to search Dash. It's context aware of where my cursor is in my editor. So I can look up the documentation, hit escape, the window closes, and I just carry on working. Dash has got integrations with every editor you could think of. Like I said, it's got over 200 frameworks and languages in there. So you shouldn't really need to get caught out with the lack of documentation for what you're working on. This is an interesting integration I've got. I use Alfred a lot, and I've got Dash hooked up to Alfred, so I don't even need to be in my code editor to look up a reference for a particular function. I can just start typing PHP, start typing a function name, scroll down to it, hit enter, bam, there we are. I've got my documentation there straight away. I used to use Google dozens of times a day to do this kind of stuff. You know, open up Google, PHP, array, whatever, to find out, like, you know, the order of the parameters, stuff like that. With Dash, I've gotten myself out of the habit of doing that. I've realized that I don't need to ask Google for information that should, if it's not in my head, it can at least be on my computer. In addition, Dash supports cheat sheets, which can be pretty handy, but it also supports third-party documentation. So you can download documentation for any package that is on the Composer Packagist site. It automatically generates documentation for every single package on there, and then you can choose which ones to get. So if you've got plugins or frameworks or libraries on Packagist, just search for them and you grab the docs, and they're available straight in Packagist. It's really great. So for commands and functionality on the CLI, offline documentation is generally there all the time. It's not something that we need to install or import. There's a good pattern for CLI documentation. You can either type man and then the command name, or you can type the command name followed by --help. As a general rule, this will cover you for pretty much any command on the command line. It will give you the help docs. For example, if you use WP CLI, you don't need to go and visit the documentation on the wpcli.org website, because all of that documentation is actually built into WP. You can bring it up with WP-help. You can page through it. You can look for help for all of the commands in there. There's no reason for you to have to go online. And this pattern of either using man or --help covers you for pretty much any command that you work with on the command line. So what about actually working while we're offline? What tools can we use to help us do our job? Well, the first tool I want to use is one of my favorite WordPress plugins. It's called Airplane Mode. It pretty much does what you'd expect it to do based on the name. It prevents WordPress from attempting to make outbound connections to the internet. So what it does is it blocks external JavaScript and CSS files. It replaces those little gravatar images with a local image. Removes all the WordPress HTTP API calls. Disables update checks for plugins and themes and core. And it actually makes quite a big performance difference to your admin area. So one of the reasons that your admin area can slow down is because of the server-side HTTP API calls that WordPress does. For example, the plugin screen in WordPress can be slow because when you load it, it might go and look for updates to plugins. So here I've got two sites side by side. One has got airplane mode enabled. One hasn't got it enabled. If we load up the plugins screen, we'll see that with airplane mode enabled, bam, that page loads immediately in 0.39 seconds. Whereas with airplane mode switched off, it takes 2.5 seconds. And those 2 seconds are due to the WordPress HTTP API going off to wordpress.org to find out if there are any updates available to plugins. So using airplane mode on a site really makes it a joy to use the WordPress admin area again, because it gets rid of all of those API calls that can slow things down, particularly when you haven't got an internet connection or you've got a poor internet connection. I actually recorded this on a fiber connection, so it only took 2 seconds, but typically on a home broadband, that could easily take more than 5 seconds for that page to load. I love it. I use airplane mode all the time. On the front end, if you aren't connected to the internet, you'll see these kind of errors coming up in your console where you can't, your browser can't connect to hosts that are on third-party hosts. If you have airplane mode enabled, what it will do is it will prevent these kind of assets trying to load in the first place. So you won't see these errors, you won't be waiting for timeouts to happen, things like that. And as a bonus, if you're using the Query Monitor debugging plugin, it'll actually tell you which scripts and styles were blocked by airplane mode, so they don't just kind of disappear into a black hole. So blocking external assets is great, but what happens if we actually need them? It's fair enough just blocking all these things, but if we actually need those assets to get our job done, what can we do? What happens if we need to perform an HTTP API call, or we need some scripts from a third-party server? What we can do is we can actually mock these kind of responses from a server instead of blocking them. You can do this using a local HTTP proxy, and you can get it to return a response that you've previously stored instead of that connection trying to go out to the internet and coming back with a network error. So let's take a look and see how this works. My preferred HTTP proxy is one called Charles Proxy. It's a cross-platform app. It's on Mac, Windows, and Linux. It's really powerful. What it does is it intercepts all of the HTTP requests that go out from your machine. It allows you to mess with the HTTP, basically do what you like. Among many things that Charles lets you do is you can spoof DNS with it. You can monitor and throttle and record HTTP requests and responses from your machine. You can set breakpoints for requests and responses, and you can rewrite requests and responses as they go out from your machine. But what we want to use it for is mapping a remote request to a local file on our file machine. So this is the local mapping screen. What I've set up here is a rule which says if Charles detects a request to example.com and the path is script.js, then what I want it to do is not actually perform that connection out to the internet. I want to short circuit it, and I want to respond with this local JavaScript file on my machine. This means that we can mock the response from the server even when I haven't got an internet connection, even when my machine can't connect to example.com. As far as my browser is concerned, or as far as my application is concerned, that request has happened just like normal. Charles is handling, mocking the response from a server. What you save in that local file, is up to you. But typically, what you want to do is before you disconnect, you can use Charles to save a valid response from that server prior to going offline. Save it as a local file, and then serve that. Now, for static files, that's pretty easy. But if you've got some dynamic data, for example, if you're performing HTTP API requests, you can actually get quite granular with the paths and things in Charles. So when I'm working with the auto-update check system in WordPress itself, I quite often don't want to be waiting for the WordPress.org API to respond. So I just save one of the responses, save it as a JSON file locally, and then Charles will instantly load that file for me instead of actually going and calling the WordPress.org API. One day I think I'm actually going to do a full talk about HTTP proxies. They're really useful. So here's something that you may not immediately think of when you're working offline. What happens if your website or your application sends out an email? Now, if you're not connected to the internet, that email isn't going to go anywhere. It's just going to disappear. What we ideally want is to be able to capture that email so we can verify that emails are actually going out as we expect. And there's two ways to do this. One is an app called MailHog. Basically how it works is it works as an SMTP server, and you can route your outgoing mail through it. And what it does is instead of actually sending the email, it will record it and store it locally, and then it will give you a nice UI that looks a bit like an inbox for you to browse the emails that have been sent out. There's also a WordPress plugin called Email Log. This is a bit easier to set up, and what it does is it captures any email that goes out through WP Mail and shows you it in the WordPress admin area. This is MailHog. Like I said, the setup is a bit more involved because you have to deal with SMTP settings, but the advantage is that it will capture any outgoing email from your machine. It gives you a nice web UI that looks a bit like an inbox. You can browse, and delete, and purge emails. So you can use this to check to make sure that your application is actually sending emails out as you expect it to. The email log plugin for WordPress does a similar thing. It stores the outgoing emails in WordPress instead of actually sending them, and then you can hit up the admin screen in WordPress and view your emails. Nice and easy to get this one set up. Interestingly, both of these solutions are actually useful for when you're online as well as offline. It's actually really useful to be able to see which outgoing emails are coming out from your app, even when you're online. And I found this to be a recurring pattern. The idea that if we think about working offline, it actually improves the way that we work when we're online. This brings us nicely on to my third point, the mindset of developing while you're offline. I used to find it really frustrating when I was traveling. I didn't have a connection, or I had a patchy connection. I felt I wasn't productive. I was always trying to get that Wi-Fi hotspot running. But one day I decided I needed to actually be productive when I was offline. And I find that being prepared means that I can actually be productive when I'm offline. It now actually feels a bit like it feels joyful maybe to work offline instead of a burden, instead of worrying about not having an internet connection. And I started using offline documentation out of necessity, but I actually find that I use it all the time now. Even though I'm online, I'll still use the offline documentation because I've become much quicker at being able to look up the documentation that I need offline without having to Google things dozens of times a day. I still Google stuff, of course, but I stop and think beforehand, do I really need to Google this, or can I actually find the answer in my offline docs? Usually the answer is yes, I can find it in my offline docs. I mentioned briefly the benefits to the end users. If we consider being offline as a network problem, we can work to make our website more resilient to network connection errors. Thinking of these unexpected benefits of working offline can really help the way you approach things. There's one big benefit I haven't mentioned so far. If you switch off the Wi-Fi on your laptop, your battery lasts so much longer. It really does, especially if you're somewhere where you don't have a Wi-Fi network at all, or you have Wi-Fi networks that you're not connected to. It actually drains your battery a lot faster because your Wi-Fi antenna, the Wi-Fi radio is active. It's trying to find a network connection. It really drains your battery. So if you switch your Wi-Fi off, your battery lasts a lot longer. And I recently discovered this is the same for your phone. If you're somewhere where you haven't got a phone signal, your phone battery will run down much faster because what happens is your phone will be actually trying to find a mobile signal while you're offline. So if you're out in the middle of a field, nowhere, you haven't got a signal, your battery is going to drain much faster. So if you switch your phone off or switch it to airplane mode, your battery is going to last a lot longer. Always be charging. My colleague Jenny Wong taught me this, especially when you're traveling. Always take every opportunity to charge your phone and your laptop because you never know when you might be offline for an extended period without access to power. So if you're at airports, if you're on a train, if you're at a conference, plug in, because you never know when you might be somewhere where you can't get some power. All right, I'm going to let you all switch your Wi-Fi back on now. I don't think many of you switched it off, did you? Yeah, doesn't look like it. For those of you who did, you'll probably feel a little bit of relief now. You're connected to the first world again. You've only been offline for, what, 20 minutes? So there's several things to consider when you reconnect. This one is quite difficult. I'm not really a heavy social media user, but I still have to make a conscious effort to not go and immediately check Twitter and Facebook and my feeds and everything when I reconnect. And the reason I try not to do that is because it causes an association. If you start checking all of your social medias and your emails every time you come back online, you'll find that you do it every single time, and that's not really good for you. So trying to get out of that habit means that it might give you a few extra minutes to finish off what you were doing and be a little bit more productive. I also regularly write notes while I'm offline. These kind of range from bug reports that I want to open to emails I've got to send, tasks I've got to do when I reconnect, reminders to myself to push the code that I've written. I use things such as Google Keep and Evernote and Simple Note, any kind of note-keeping or task-keeping app that works offline will do. It's really important, though, because you'll often find that as you work offline, you think of things that you need to do when you reconnect. So having a kind of an established workflow for managing this is quite important. I also take notes of the problems that I've had. For example, if I've got some dependencies in my project that didn't get pulled in originally, I'll make a note of that so I can fix it. So the next time I go offline, I don't have to worry about it. Basically, I'm always trying to improve my offline workflow. And that just brings me to my final point about working offline. What happens if you mess it up? What happens if you find yourself on a transatlantic flight and you haven't got a working development environment? What can I get done when I haven't got an internet connection and I haven't got a development environment? Well, you probably find that your project needs some documentation. Every project needs documentation. You can actually write documentation without an active development environment. You can write inline docs, you can write README files, you can update the wiki pages if you've cloned that GitHub wiki repo. Everyone benefits from documentation. I also make a point of making sure that I've got some articles saved in my Instapaper feed for offline reading, so I can maybe spend some time learning, reading some articles, so at least I'm not wasting time if I haven't got a development environment. And in the past, I've written project specifications, I've done user journeys, all this kind of stuff while I'm offline. The point is that the more you think about it, the more you realize that you don't always need to be online to actually be productive, whether that's development work, planning, spec writing, whatever. You can actually get quite a lot more done than you think. But if all else fails, what can you do? I find I see this screen more often than I should, really. I go and open up Chrome and type in a URL and I'm offline. You can be productive on this screen as well. If you hit the space bar there, this little dinosaur turns into a runner and you can sit there and try and beat your high score. The dinosaur actually has a use. There we are. That was an intentionally short run. And finally, I just want to mention this. I found this the other day. This is called thedisconnect.co. This is a new publication that's just appeared online. If you hit up thedisconnect.co, it will tell you that you need to disconnect to read it. And what it does is it uses the latest offline technology in browsers. So you go online, you go to the website, and then you have to disconnect your Wi-Fi in order to be able to read anything in the publication. And it's got some really nice fiction, it's got some really interesting non-fiction, and there's some poetry in there. And it's all about the topic of disconnecting, about being offline, and there's some really thoughtful pieces in there. So I definitely recommend checking this out. The first edition came out just last week, I think, so check that out. Thanks for listening.
I think we have time for one question.
13 seconds.
Yeah, it's a 13-second question.
I'm also going to be around for lunch, if you want to come and chat.
Maybe, I know the benefits to the end users, that's great. Maybe you could talk just a little bit about where that you've seen like a failure or where it's been a really benefit. Like, for example, not just slow network connections, but in a corporate environment where you have like firewalls which block certain external services, we've run into that.
Oh, yeah. I think the most common place I see it is, where I work at HumanMade, we deal with lots of large online publishers, and typically they have lots of advertising networks, lots of trackers, analytics, all these kind of things all coming in from third parties. What you can find, if you're not careful, some of the core functionality on the site can rely on those third-party applications. So as an example, I've seen sites where they have a button, and when you click it, there's an event on that button that goes and calls a piece of code that it's expecting to be there from a third-party analytics provider or some kind of third-party service. And because that code hasn't loaded from the third-party service, it gives you a JavaScript error, and your site just doesn't work. So what you need to do in that case is have some code in there which expects that it might not be able to call a function. It can't assume that there's a function that's come in from a third-party library. So you might want to do something like a try-catch, catch some kind of error, or check if the function exists. It kind of depends on use case. But the idea is to not assume that a piece of JavaScript that's come from a third party is always there. That's probably the most common pattern is analytics, ad providers, trackers, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, John.
Thanks.